The
Take it
morning Nora
down!
Aldrich found the notice she had been awake since before dawn. She
Yeah,
had gone
look at
out
that!
to check the cold frames the way she did every morning that time of year, moving through the gray pre-light with a flashlight and the particular attentiveness of someone responsible for living things. The frost had been light. The seedlings were fine. She was walking back toward the house when she saw it, a folded sheet of paper stapled to the wooden post at the
Look at
eastern
all
fence
this
line.
lavender.
The
It's
paper already damp
beautiful.
with dew, the staple already
We'll have
beginning
enough
to
to last
rust
the
at its
winter.
edges, as if it had been there long enough to start belonging to the wood. She pulled it free. She read it once standing there in the field with her flashlight aimed at the page, the cold coming through her barn coat, the sound of the creek at the northern edge of the property moving in the dark. Then she read it again more slowly. Then a third time, because the third reading was the one where she let herself believe what it said. It was a legal notice from Hargrove & Sons Development, LLC, informing her that construction would begin on the 340 acres directly east of her property within 60 days. A regional distribution hub, roads, concrete, floodlights, the kind of infrastructure that does not apologize for existing and does not ask whether anyone nearby had other plans, because the legal framework under which it operates has already decided that question, and the answer was that her preferences were not part of the calculation. She folded the notice carefully along its original creases and put it in the front pocket of her canvas jacket. Then she stood at the fence line for a long moment and looked east across the empty field, the sky lightening very slowly above the tree line, the dark mass of old hardwoods that had stood between the two properties for as long as anyone in Harlan County could remember. And she thought about her grandmother, and she thought about the bees, and she went inside to finish her coffee. She was 22 years old. She had been living on the farm for 18 months. But we are getting ahead of ourselves because the story of the Aldrich farm and what happened to it does not begin with that notice and does not begin with Nora. It begins with a woman named Harriet Aldrich who had farmed 80 acres of river bottom land in Harlan County, Kentucky for the better part of 50 years and who had understood things about that particular piece of ground that no soil survey had ever properly captured and no extension agent had ever thought to ask about. Harriet had come to the land as a young bride in the early 1970s and had stayed as a widow through the 1990s and had grown old there with the deliberate rootedness of a tree that has survived long enough to become part of the landscape itself. She grew heirloom vegetables varieties with names that sounded like old family recipes: Cherokee Purple Mortgage, Lifter Dragon Tongue, the kind of names that carried history in them. She kept bees not as a hobby, but as a form of sustained attention, a way of reading the land that she had come to trust more than any instrument. She maintained a seed library that she had started from a single wooden box her own mother had carried across 3 state lines during the Depression, a box that smelled of cedar and dried lavender and the particular gravity of things saved because they might someday be needed and because someone had loved them enough to carry them. The farm was not large by any commercial measure. 80 acres. A wood frame house that needed a new roof by the time Nora arrived. A barn that leaned slightly south as if it had been listening to something in that direction for decades. But it was the kind of place that changed the way you breathed when you walked onto it, the air different, somehow heavier, with something mineral and green and alive, the soil darker than the fields on either side of it. A deep, almost black color that meant the organic matter was rich and the microbiology was working. The creek that ran along the northern edge of the property was cold and clear, even in August, running over flat limestone and gravel in a way that made you want to put your hand in it. Nora had spent every summer of her childhood there. Not every weekend, not occasional visits, every summer from the time she was 5 years old until she went to college at 18, arriving in June and leaving in late August, with her feet calloused and her arms brown, and her understanding of the world organized around things that grew and changed with the season. She had learned to read the weather by the way the swallows flew low before a storm, the way the light went yellow in a particular way when the barometric pressure dropped. She had learned the difference between the taste of a tomato grown in composted soil and one grown in ground fed by commercial fertilizer, and the difference was not subtle, and she had never been able to unlearn it. She had learned that the bees Harriet kept were not a hobby, but a form of attention, a way of understanding what was happening in the land at a level that no instrument she knew of could fully replicate. Harriet had always said, when you want to know what the land is doing, follow the bees and trust what they find. When Harriet died in her sleep on a November night quietly, the way people sometimes do when they have been good their whole lives and the world decides finally to be gentle with them. In that last moment, she left Nora the farm, just the farm, the house and the 80 acres and the barn and the tools and the notebooks and the seeds and the bees and the creeks and the soil that had been in the family since 1974. No money to speak of, a small agricultural loan on the property that Harriet had taken out in 2019 and that Nora inherited along with everything else. A wood frame house with a roof that leaked over the bathroom in heavy rain. Everyone expected Nora to sell. She had a degree she had not finished using 2 semesters of agricultural science at the state university before she had left to come home and be with Harriet when Harriet got sick the first time, and then a second time, and then the third time that turned out to be the last. She was 22 years old. She had, by the reckoning of every adult in her life who spoke to her about it in the months following Harriet's death, every practical reason in the world to sell the property, take the money and start her actual life somewhere with more options and fewer structural problems. She didn't. She moved in with 2 boxes of clothes and a quiet certainty that the land was where she was supposed to be, and she had not looked back once in the 18 months since, not even on the mornings when the roof leaked into the bathroom and the tractor wouldn't start, and the accounts showed less money than she needed to feel comfortable. She had planted her first season's crops in the spring following Harriet's death. She had rebuilt the cold frames that had rotted along the south wall of the barn. She had requeened the 2 hives that were struggling. She had introduced herself to the farmer's market in the county seat and spent 2 seasons learning which of her products sold and which didn't, and why, taking that information back to the farm and adjusting. She had been managing, barely some months, but managing. She had not looked back until the morning she found the notice. The notice changed things in ways that were both practical and invisible. Practically, it meant she had 60 days before the eastern field. She had always considered a kind of natural extension of her own land, a buffer of old hardwoods and open meadow that the birds used heavily during migration, and that had always seemed in the logic of the farm to belong to its world, even if it didn't belong to her legally, would become a construction zone. It meant dust and noise and light and traffic and a fundamental alteration of everything that had made the eastern boundary of the farm what it was. Invisibly, it meant something else, something she was still working out when her neighbor Darlene Cobb knocked on the back door 2 mornings later. Darlene was 58 years old and had lived on the property to the north of the Aldrich farm for most of her adult life, since she had married into the Cobb family at 23, and stayed on after her husband Walter died of a heart attack in the orchard he had been planting for 20 years and never quite finished. She was the kind of woman who communicated through food when words failed her, who showed up at difficult moments with something warm in a dish, and the understanding that sometimes sitting together and eating is the only form of comfort that actually reaches people. She appeared at Nora's back door with a dish of scalloped potatoes and the expression of someone who had been worrying about something for several days and had finally decided that showing up was better than continuing to worry. She had heard about the notice. Everyone in Harlan County had heard about the notice by then, because in a county with 9,000 people, legal notices stapled to fence posts have a way of becoming known. She set the potatoes on the counter and sat down at Nora's kitchen table and talked about Harriet, the way old friends talk about the dead, with a specificity and warmth that made the person feel briefly present in the room. She told Nora about the time Harriet had chased a county assessor off the property with a garden rake because he had driven up without calling ahead and walked right into the east garden without asking, and about how she had stood at the fence line afterward, watching him drive away with his clipboard, and had looked exactly as satisfied as a person can look. She told her about the summer when the creek flooded its bank, and Harriet had waited out at 2 in the morning in her nightgown to redirect the overflow away from the beehives, working in the dark with a flashlight between her teeth, ankle deep in cold water, moving stones and pulling branches until the water found a different path. She told her that Harriet had been the most stubborn woman she had ever known, and she said it with the particular warmth of someone who means stubborn as the highest possible compliment. Nora listened. She poured coffee. She let Darlene talk because the talking seemed to help, and because she was learning things she had not known, small things. The particular shape of Harriet's stubbornness as it appeared to other people from the outside, which was different from the way it had felt to be the granddaughter on the receiving end of it. When Darlene finally asked what Nora planned to do about the development, Nora told her she hadn't decided yet. Darlene nodded like a woman who didn't quite believe that, but respected the answer. She left the potatoes and said she would check back in. She came back 2 days later with a pan of cornbread and the information that she had heard the county had already approved Hargrove's permits. Within 2 weeks of the notice, the others came. Vernon Doss was her neighbor to the southeast, a man in his late 60s who had farmed the same land his father had farmed and his father's father before that, who delivered bad news with the practiced solemnity of someone who has done it many times and has learned that the delivery does not make it easier, but at least makes it sincere. He leaned against her porch rail one afternoon in early spring with his hat in his hands and told her she should talk to a real estate agent before the construction started. He told her the development would bring truck traffic around the clock, 18-wheelers at 2 and 4 in the morning, headlights sweeping across bedroom ceilings, air brakes on the access road. He told her about the light pollution, the kind that confused poultry, disrupted the sleep patterns of animals and people alike, made the night sky go orange above the tree line. He told her the noise would stress every living thing on the property in ways that were cumulative and hard to quantify until they were already done. He told her she was young and she had options. He told her that Harriet had been a remarkable woman, but that Harriet was gone and the land was Nora's now to do with as she thought best, and that thinking practically was not the same as giving up. He had a cousin who had sold his place after a highway went in 2 miles away and had done well by it. Nora offered him coffee. He declined. He left with the look of a man who had done what he could. Then came Stuart Pruitt. Stuart Pruitt was the county's most successful agricultural broker, a man whose suits were always pressed and whose opinions were always delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most informed person in the room. He drove to the farm on a Tuesday afternoon in a clean truck parked precisely, came to the door with a printed comp sheet and a practiced friendliness that had been developed over decades of conversations exactly like this one. He sat at Nora's kitchen table with the numbers laid out in clean columns and explained in careful, reasonable language that her land would likely peak in value in the window before construction began and decline steadily thereafter. Distribution centers depress property values within a half-mile radius. It was documented. He had the data. He had a buyer lined up, he said. A good buyer. Somebody who knew the county and understood the land. Clean offer, clear title, the kind of transaction that went smoothly because nobody was surprised by anything. Nora thanked him. She said she would think about it. He stood to leave and then paused at the door with his hand on the frame and turned back to look at her. The professional friendliness had shifted not much, but enough to notice if you were watching. He said that he had been working in Harlan County for 23 years and that he knew every serious agricultural buyer in the region, and that when a property had issues, environmental concerns, or structural problems, or what he called reputational factors, meaning the kind of stories that attached to a place when things went badly, those buyers heard about it. He said it the way a man says something that contains two meanings and depends on the listener to choose which one to receive. He said he hoped they could work together before things got complicated. Nora held the door open. She thanked him again. She watched his clean truck go down the farm road and turn onto the county road and disappear. She did not call him back. The hardware store owner stopped her in his shop on a Saturday and told her the noise alone, the sustained low-frequency vibration of a commercial facility operating around the clock, would push her laying hens into non-production within a season. The woman who ran the feed co-op told her that honeybees did not survive sustained industrial vibration, that she had seen it happen to a beekeeper over in the next county when the quarry expanded, that the colonies simply abandoned the hives. The pastor mentioned gently in the particular register that pastors use for difficult conversations that sometimes letting go of something we love is the bravest kind of love, and that Harriet would have wanted Nora to be free rather than burdened. Nora listened to all of it. She nodded at the parts that were true. There were true parts. The vibration concern was real. The light pollution was real. The traffic was going to be exactly as bad as Vernon Doss said it was going to be. She filed the true parts and filed the rest. What she did not tell any of them, what she had not yet explained to a single living person, was that 2 days after Vernon Doss's visit, a man named Roy Tanner had knocked on her door. Roy Tanner was a loan officer at the local branch of the regional bank that held the agricultural loan Harriet had taken out in 2019, and that Nora had inherited along with the property. He was a trim, careful man in his early 50s who presented the visit as a routine property review, the kind of thing the bank did periodically for agricultural accounts. Nothing to be concerned about, just standard procedure. He sat in Harriet's chair at the kitchen table with a notepad and asked questions about her current income, her projected yields for the coming season, her plans for capital improvements, her assessment of the farm's operational capacity going forward. The questions were polite, they were organized, they were also shaped in a way that Nora noticed and did not comment on. They circled around a central question from multiple directions without ever asking it directly whether the proximity of the Hargrove development had affected her confidence in the farm's viability as a long-term financial proposition, whether a declining property value might create problems for her loan-to-asset ratio, whether she had read the environmental change clauses in her inherited loan agreement, which gave the bank certain rights to reassess collateral value when adjacent land use changed significantly. Nora answered each question precisely and factually. She noted the shape of the questions. She thanked Roy Tanner for his time and walked him to the door and stood on the porch and watched him get into his car, which was a newer model than the salary of a loan officer at a rural branch bank typically explained. She memorized the license plate number. She went back inside and wrote the date and time of the visit in the farm ledger, along with a summary of what he had said and what she believed he had been trying to find out. She wrote it in the clean declarative sentences that Harriet had always used in her notebooks, the sentences that had nothing in them except what happened, who, what, when, where, and what it appeared to mean. She was not sure yet what she was going to do with the information. But Harriet had always said that documentation was what stood between memory and proof, and that there was always a difference. The excavators arrived on a Wednesday in late March. Nora stood at the eastern fence line and watched them come, massive yellow machines rolling down off flatbed trailers with the particular purposeful efficiency of equipment that has been doing what it does for a long time and has no uncertainty about it. She counted 7 of them. She stood there for a long time, long enough for the light to change from the gray of early morning to the harder light of midday, long enough for one of the operators to notice her standing at the fence line and look at her, and then look away, in the way that people look away from things that are easier not to make into a confrontation. By sundown of the first day, the old hardwood windbreak that had stood between the two properties for 60 years was gone. Not damaged, not partially cleared. Gone. Stumps and tire tracks in churned earth, in a silence where there had been birdsong for as long as anyone in the county could remember, a silence that felt louder than the machines had been. The trees had been there before Harriet had come to the land. They had been there before the farm was the farm in the way it had become the farm. They had been there when the birds came through in spring and fall, using the tree line as a navigational landmark for migrations that had been following the same routes for thousands of years before anyone thought to develop the land. And now they were stumps. Nora stood at the fence line and looked at the stumps and thought about the birds. She thought about what it meant to remove from the landscape something that had been there long enough to be counted on. Then she went inside. The dust began the next morning, a fine pale silt that rose from the stripped earth in the morning light and settled on everything within reach, the garden beds, the cold frames along the south wall of the barn, the glass faces of the solar panels on the barn roof, the wooden hive bodies in the bee yard. Nora washed her salad greens twice before she sold them at the farmer's market that Saturday, and she told the customers who asked that the washing was thorough and the food was clean, and she believed it. But she understood for the first time what it would mean to spend the next 2 or 3 years farming next to a construction site of this size. Her yields dropped 30% in the first month. The noise was constant, not thunderous, but relentless, a low mechanical drone that pressed against the edges of concentration in a way that made sustained work harder and made sleep light and unsatisfying. Her hen's egg production dipped by a quarter. 2 of her oldest and most established hives swarmed early in the season and did not return, which was a loss not only of the colonies, but of the particular genetic line those queens had represented, a line Harriet had been developing for 11 years. The creek ran brown for 3 weeks after a heavy rain in April, carrying fine gray sediment down from the stripped earth on the construction site. Nora tested the water. The sediment load was high, but the chemical content was within legal parameters. She documented it anyway, not for a lawsuit. The county extension agent had already told her that what Hargrove was doing was entirely within its legal rights. But because documentation was what Harriet had taught her to do, and because she did not yet know what she would need to know later, a project manager from Hargrove named Leonard Colgate stopped at her gate one morning in mid-April. He was a compact man in his late 40s, wearing a yellow hard hat and a high-visibility vest, with the professionally calm manner of someone who has learned to distinguish between hostility and calculation in the people he encounters, and to adjust his approach accordingly. He gave her his business card with a practiced confidence that was not arrogance, but something more like certainty, the certainty of a person who does this regularly and has learned what it usually looks like. He told her his company had programs in place for neighboring property owners, noise mitigation packages, temporary barrier fencing along property lines, a dedicated liaison she could call with concerns or complaints. He handed her a pamphlet that had been professionally printed and folded into thirds. Nora took the pamphlet. She thanked him with a politeness that was genuine and gave away nothing. She read the pamphlet that evening at the kitchen table and filed it in the same drawer as the original notice in the back, where she was keeping the things she might eventually need. She still had not told anyone her plan. The answer, when she found it, was in a notebook. Harriet had kept dozens of them over the decades, spiral-bound books in various colors and sizes. Their cardboard covers soft with handling, filled with her slanted handwriting that became increasingly compressed as she aged, as if she were trying to fit more into each page as the pages became more finite. Nora had been reading through them since moving in, working chronologically the way you read a person's correspondence. After they're gone, feeling the particular combination of intimacy and violation that comes from having access to the thinking of someone who is no longer alive to explain it. Most of the notebooks were practical crop rotation schedules, rainfall measurements going back to 1971, soil test results, bee population counts, temperature, and humidity sogs for the cold frames. Some of them were philosophical in a way that was distinctly Harriet's, observations about the nature of farming and land and time that had the quality of things a person works out for themselves over a long time and writes down not to share but to have. There was one notebook that Nora had set aside months ago when she had first come across it because it seemed different from the others in a way she hadn't been able to articulate at the time. Harriet had labeled it simply in her cramped, slanted hand, "What the Bees Know." She opened it on a rainy April night when she couldn't sleep, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of chamomile tea and the rain coming down steady against the windows and the sound of the creek higher than usual from the spring rain. She had expected notes on hive management or records of honey yields, or perhaps Harriet's observations on the foraging behavior of the various strains of bees she had kept over the years. What she found instead was 8 years of methodical, patient fieldwork devoted to a question that Harriet had apparently decided she was going to answer herself because no one else was going to bother. The question was this: where exactly were her bees going? Honeybees forage within a radius of roughly 2 miles from their hive, and within that range they are selective in ways that most beekeepers do not fully map. Harriet had begun the project by marking individual forager bees from her hives with small dots of colored paint, a different color for each hive to track their movements. She had trained herself to follow them at dawn and at dusk when the light was right and the bees moved at a pace that a person with good eyes and patience could track for short distances. She had built a series of hand-drawn maps of the farm and the surrounding land, updated season by season, annotating them with her observations in a notation system she had developed herself. What she had found across 8 years of observation was that her bees were consistently and purposefully returning to a particular stretch of the land directly to the east, the land that was now being excavated. They were not going there for nectar. The forage on that stretch of meadow grass was ordinary, nothing that would explain the consistent preference. They were going for something Harriet had spent 2 full seasons researching before she found the language for it. She had written the term in the margin of her field notes, circled twice with her ballpoint pen: mineral foraging. Honeybees collect water as well as nectar and pollen. Most people who keep bees know this but do not fully appreciate it. Bees collect water to cool the hive through evaporation on hot days, to process nectar into honey, and to maintain the humidity levels that a healthy colony requires for brood development. But water sources are not equal to bees because water carries dissolved minerals in varying concentrations, depending on its source, and mineral-rich water carrying dissolved calcium and magnesium and iron and selenium and other trace elements from deep geological formations supports colony health in ways that ordinary surface water cannot replicate. Experienced beekeepers who notice their bees foraging persistently at unusual sources, old puddles of road salt, run-off muddy depressions, the edges of masonry foundations that leach lime, and are usually witnessing this behavior. The bees have found water that gives their bodies something they need, something the flora and the ordinary rain cannot supply. Harriet had found her bees returning from the eastern land consistently across seasons, with what she described in the notebook in language that was precise and unexpectedly beautiful as high mineral load water. Not nectar, not pollen, water. They were flying to the eastern land not for food but for medicine, and she had followed them there and found the source. On page 47 of the notebook, underlined twice with a firm pressure that had left a groove in the paper mineral-rich clay seep. Nora sat up straighter at the kitchen table. The tea had gone cold. She was not aware of it. The entry went on for 3 dense pages, the handwriting compressed and focused in the way it became when Harriet was writing about something that mattered to her. She had located a natural seep on the eastern land, a place where the groundwater was being pushed upward through a layer of iron-bearing clay and emerging at the surface, carrying with it the dissolved mineral content of whatever geological formation it had been in contact with deep below. The bees had found it first. She had found it by following the bees. And then she had noticed something else, something it had taken her 2 more years to understand. The seep's influence did not stop at the surface. The same groundwater that was feeding the seep appeared to be connected to the Aldrich farm's own water table through an underground pathway feeding the creek that ran along the northern edge of the property, slowly percolating upward through the river-bottom soil and depositing its mineral content as it moved. The particular richness of the Aldrich farm's soil, the depth of color, and the density of organic matter, and the trace mineral profile that showed up in every soil test Harriet had ever had done, was not solely the result of 50 years of careful composting and cover cropping and soil building, though that work had amplified it considerably. There was something geological underneath it, something coming from underground and moving through the earth in a way that had been working before Harriet arrived and would continue or not continue based on what happened to the water table. Near the end of the notebook, on a page that appeared to have been written some years after the main entries, the ink slightly different and the handwriting a little less certain, as if written by a hand that had aged. Harriet had added a single sentence at the bottom of the page and underlined it once. Nora read it carefully. She read it twice. If this land is ever disturbed, the seep will either be destroyed or redirected. Watch the creek. The creek will tell you what is happening underground. Nora closed the notebook. She sat at the kitchen table for a very long time and listened to the rain and thought about what she had just read and what it might mean. She thought about the geological logic of it, the way water moves through subsurface clay layers under pressure, finding the path of least resistance, redirecting when obstacles were introduced. She thought about construction, about the vast machines she had watched arrive that morning and what they did to the layers of soil and clay beneath the ground. She thought about disruption and about redirection and about the possibility that what looked like destruction from the surface was doing something entirely different underground. Then she got dressed. She put on her barn coat and her rubber boots. She went outside into the rain, walked to the northern edge of the property in the dark, and stood at the bank of the creek with her flashlight aimed at the water. The creek was running brown with sediment from the construction. She stood there in the rain for a long time and watched it. She watched it the way Harriet had taught her to watch things, with patience and without deciding what it meant before it was ready to tell her. She was beginning to understand. But there was something else in the notebook that had caught at the back of her mind while she was reading something she had registered and set aside to return to, and now standing in the rain at the edge of the creek, it surfaced fully. On page 11, pressed between 2 sheets of graph paper covered in Harriet's hand-drawn foraging maps, there was a folded piece of paper. Not a page from the notebook. A separate piece off-white, the kind of paper that had once been white and had yellowed slightly with age, folded in thirds, as if it had been handed over in person or mailed. Nora had noticed it while reading and had registered it as probably a receipt or a seed catalog, clipping the kind of thing people use as bookmarks, and had moved past it. She went back inside. She unfolded the paper carefully because the fold lines had weakened and she did not want to tear it. It was not a receipt. It was a note written in a hand that was not Harriet's. Tighter and more angular, the letters formed with a precision that suggested someone who had been taught penmanship in an era when it was taken seriously. It was not dated. It read in full, "Harriet, I'm asking you as a friend not to take this to the extension office or the university. If this goes public, it complicates things I cannot explain to you right now. Please trust me on this." Wait. There was no signature. Nora turned it over. The back was blank. She sat down at the kitchen table with the note in her hands and looked at the rain on the window glass and thought about who might have written it and when and what it was asking Harriet not to make public and why making it public would complicate things for an anonymous person who apparently knew what Harriet had found, and whether Hargrove and Sons Development, LLC, when they chose this particular stretch of land in Harlan County, Kentucky, had known exactly what was underneath it. She did not sleep for a long time that night. In the morning, she drove to the county library. She spent 2 full weeks reading before she told anyone anything she was thinking. She read everything the county library had on hydrology. She read about aquifer systems in the Appalachian foothills, about karst geology in mineral-bearing subsurface, flows about the way clay layers behave under the pressure of construction, and the redistribution of soil weight across broad areas. She read about the documented behavior of mineral seeps, when their source geology was disturbed, the cases in which they vanished, and the cases in which they found new outlets along existing fault lines or clay interfaces, redirecting their flow to emerge somewhere else entirely. She read about a concept called terroir. The word was French and was used primarily in winemaking, but Nora had come across it in an agricultural context in one of the food production journals that the library subscribed to, and she spent 3 days following the thread of it through various academic and trade publications. The concept was simple but had large implications. The idea that the specific geology of a place, its mineral content, its subsurface water chemistry, the particular combination of elements in its soil, could produce flavors in the food grown there that were genuinely unrepeatable elsewhere. Not different in some vague and romantic sense, but chemically distinct, measurably different in ways that serious tasters and increasingly serious food science could document. Wine people had known this for centuries. Vegetable people had barely begun to think about it. She read about markets. She read about the specialty produce world, the network of restaurant groups and artisan producers and dedicated buyers who had emerged over the previous decade in American cities, paying significant premiums for documented provenance and unusual flavor profiles for food that came with a story that was also a verifiable fact. She read case studies of small farms that had pivoted from volume commodity production to specialty production, what the transition looked like, how long it took to build the relationships, what the numbers looked like at the end. And she developed a theory. If the construction on the eastern land disrupted the clay seep rather than destroying it, the mineral-rich groundwater feeding that seep would need somewhere to go. Water under subsurface pressure does not simply stop when its outlet is blocked. It redirects. It finds the path of least resistance through the existing geology, following the clay interfaces and the fault lines in the gradients of the formation. The disruption of the soil and clay layers on the eastern parcel might push the underground flow westward along the existing river bottom geology toward the farm. Toward the low ground in the western corner of the field, where the soil had always been a little wetter than the rest and the grass grew slightly differently in a way that Harriet had noted in several of her crop rotation journals, but had never fully explained. This was a theory. It was not a certainty. The seep might be destroyed entirely, and with it the mineral source that made the farm's soil what it was, and that had been building the flavor profile of Harriet's vegetables for 50 years. The river bottom soil would not become ordinary quickly. The mineral deposits built up over decades did not wash out in a season, but without the ongoing input from the underground source, the exceptional quality would fade over years and eventually become something that was still good, but no longer what it had been. She held both possibilities with equal weight. She was not a person who convinced herself of things because she needed them to be true. She had grown up in this farm, watching Harriet make decisions based on evidence and observation and the honest assessment of what she did and did not know, and she had internalized that way of thinking as completely as she had internalized the taste of a properly grown tomato. What she knew was this: if the theory proved out, she would have something extraordinary. She would have a piece of ground whose exceptional flavor was the direct traceable result of a specific geological event whose mineral profile was documented in Harriet's notebooks going back decades and in the lab results of every soil test that had ever been run on the property and whose story was true and verifiable. And the kind of thing that serious food writers and specialty buyers and restaurant chefs who cared about provenance would pay serious money to be connected to. And the story would be the development that everyone told her would destroy the farm had redirected the underground mineral source that made the farm what it was, moving it from the eastern land, where it would be buried under concrete forever, to the farm itself, where it would feed the soil indefinitely. The machines that came to take everything were the very force that gave it all back. She closed the last of the library books. She sat in the carrel at the county library for a long time with her notes in front of her and thought about what she was willing to bet. Her plan, when she finally assembled it fully in her mind, sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening in late April with the spring peepers going outside and a cup of tea at her elbow, was not complicated, but it required the earth to cooperate. Stop competing on volume. Stop trying to produce what larger farms in the county produced more cheaply and without the constraints she was operating under. Stop trying to be a farm that made sense by the measures that applied to most farms. If the mineral shift happened, pivot entirely to what no other farm in the region could replicate: traceable, geologically documented heirloom specialty production with a story that was scientific and true and compelling. Build the pricing around the documentation. Find the buyers who understood what they were buying. Price for the story, not just the food. It required the mineral seep to redirect. It required her to stay solvent long enough for that to happen, which might take years. It required her to document everything so carefully that when the time came, the story would be provable rather than just claimable. And it required her to hold this plan entirely to herself, because the moment she explained it to anyone in Heartland County, it would become either the thing they all tried to talk her out of or the thing they all tried to profit from, and she needed it to be neither. She thought about what Harriet had written in the 1989 notebook, the one labeled Bad Years, in what they teach, in a section near the back that she had read twice in the weeks after moving in. The land is not being unkind when it is difficult. It is asking whether you are serious. She was serious. She went home and planted her spring crops. Stuart Pruitt came back 2 weeks later, and this time he did not come to the house. He found her in the parking lot of the feed co-op on a Thursday morning, which was a setting that had been chosen, she suspected, rather than arrived at accidentally, because it was a less formal space than her kitchen table. And the social rules were slightly different, and he was a man who understood the difference. He was pleasant. He said he had been thinking about their conversation and wanted to make sure she had all the information she needed to make a good decision. He mentioned the buyer again. He mentioned the window of opportunity and how it would close as the construction progressed and the uncertainty around the property increased. And then, in a tone that was still friendly but had changed register in a way she registered precisely, he mentioned that he was in regular contact with the specialty produce buyers and distributors working the Nashville and Lexington markets, that those relationships were long-standing and built on trust, and that a producer's reputation in those networks depended heavily on how she was regarded by established brokers who worked in those channels, since it was often through those relationships that introductions were made. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I appreciate that, Stuart. I'll keep it in mind." He drove away. She stood in the parking lot and watched him go and thought about what he had just told her. Not the surface content of it, but the structure, underneath the implication that the specialty food market she was planning to pivot into was a market he had influence in, and that his assessment of her would precede her into it if she chose not to do business with him. She thought about the unsigned note in Harriet's notebook. She thought about Roy Tanner and his carefully shaped questions. She thought about the creek running brown and the stumps and the dust on the beehives. She did not feel afraid. She felt like a woman who has just realized that the game she thought she was watching is not the game being played, that the stakes are different from what she had understood them to be, and that she has been, without knowing it, holding better cards than anyone at the table has given her credit for. She bought her seed order. She drove home. She checked the creek. She began to wait. The summer that followed was the kind that teaches you who you are not in the gradual way that most learning happens, not in the measured years of formal education or the incremental adjustments of a career, but in the compressed and unrelenting way of a season that gives you no room to think and expects you to act correctly anyway. The distribution center rose on the eastern land faster than the permits had suggested, the steel skeleton of it visible above the remnants of the tree line by June and enclosed and roofed by the 4th of July. Hargrove and Sons ran an efficient operation. She gave them that. The trucks began the second week of July, not occasional trucks during daylight hours, not a modest increase in local traffic. 18-wheelers on a 24-hour operating cycle running the access road that Hargrove had graded along the eastern boundary of her property at intervals that varied by the hour but averaged to something between 15 and 25 minutes day and night. She learned their rhythm the way you learn the rhythm of any intrusive sound that you cannot stop but must live alongside by feel by the slight structural vibration that came through the floor of the farmhouse a few seconds before the lights swept across her bedroom ceiling. 2 in the morning, 4 in the morning, the gray pre-dawn hour before 5:30. The rhythm of distribution, which is the rhythm of everything Americans buy and consume arriving from somewhere else, landing on her land as sound and light and a low mechanical trembling that she could feel in her back teeth when she was standing near the fence line. She adapted. She rearranged her sleep into segments, going to bed early and rising early and accepting a nap in the midday quiet as part of the structure of the day, rather than a failure of discipline. She moved her most light-sensitive seedlings to the western cold frames, the ones that were shielded from the artificial glow by the barn. She extended shade cloth over the heirloom lettuces that had been bolting early all summer, their biological clocks confused by the perpetual orange dusk the floodlights cast across the eastern half of the property. She documented every adaptation in the farm, ledger noting the date and the specific cause and the result because documentation had become so thoroughly internalized by then that it required no effort. It was simply the way she experienced the farm as a place where things happened and were recorded, and the record was what stood between this year and next year. Her bee population stabilized through August, which was better than she had feared, given everything the feed co-op woman had said about sustained vibration. But the honey yields were down by a third from Harriet's recorded averages for the same months, and the flavor was different in a way that Nora could taste but could not yet put numbers to, less complex, less layered, the particular mineral depth that had made Harriet's summer honey something people drove to the farmer's market specifically to buy, had gone flat in a way that was noticeable and worrying. The bees were still working. They were just working without the eastern seep to forage from, and whatever that source had given them was no longer available. The creek was still brown, carrying sediment from the stripped and graded earth next door. She tested the water every 2 weeks and recorded the results. The sediment load remained elevated. The mineral content of the water, which had always been the metric she was watching, had changed in a way that was hard to read clearly through the sediment, lower in some measures, different in others. She wrote everything down and waited. Then came the Saturday at the farmer's market that changed the temperature of everything. She had set up her table at 7 in the morning the way she always did on Saturdays, unpacking the jars of summer honey and the early tomatoes and the dried herbs and the small stone fruit preserves from the trees along the western fence, the peach and plum varieties that Harriet had planted decades ago and that produced reliably regardless of what was happening on the eastern side of the property. The market ran along the main street of the county seat, 30-odd vendors in a double row under canopies, a community she had been working her way into since her first uncertain Saturday 18 months ago, the quiet solidarity of people who spend their weeks making things and their Saturdays finding out what they are worth. Stuart Pruitt was not a farmer. He was not a vendor. He had no rational business being at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning in August. She noticed him almost immediately when he appeared at the far end of the vendor row, moving slowly along the displays, stopping at tables, picking things up, speaking briefly to people. He was dressed casually in the way of a man who is trying to blend in and knows the attempt is imperfect. She watched him without appearing to watch him in the peripheral, attentive way that she had learned from Harriet, who had always said that you learn more about a situation by not looking directly at it than by staring. He stopped at a table 2 down from hers, where a couple she knew slightly, Tom and Adeline Burke, were selling cut flowers and late-season vegetables, and she could see from where she stood a small display of honey jars they had sourced from her that week under an informal sharing arrangement. She watched Pruitt pick up one of her honey jars. She watched him examine the label. She watched him say something to Adeline Burke, and she watched Adeline's expression change just slightly in the way expressions change when someone says something that introduces a concern that was not there before. He set the jar down. He moved on. He stopped at two more tables after that. Each time a brief conversation. Each time a slightly changed expression on the face of the vendor he spoke to. Then he moved back along the road toward the parking area, not stopping again, and disappeared. By 10 o'clock in the morning, two customers who had been buying her honey for more than a year, regular Saturday faces that she had come to recognize, as reliably as she recognized the vendors, stopped at her table and asked each of them in slightly different phrasing whether she had heard anything about contamination concerns associated with the construction site adjacent to her farm. She had not heard anything because there were no contamination concerns. She had tested her water, her soil, her honey, and her produce consistently since the construction began. Everything had come back clean. The construction was damaging to her operation in numerous ways that she was documenting carefully and comprehensively, but it was not contaminating her products. She told the customers this. She was direct and calm and did not make it into anything larger than a factual clarification. She showed one of them the most recent water test result she happened to have in the folder she kept in her truck. He bought 2 jars. The other customer thanked her and moved on without buying anything, with the expression of someone who had decided to wait and see. By noon, she had sold less than half of what she typically sold on a summer Saturday. She packed up at 2 in the afternoon and drove home and sat in the kitchen with the farm ledger open in front of her and thought about what had just happened with the clear-eyed precision of someone who had decided not to be surprised by things she should have anticipated. She wrote down what she had observed in the declarative factual sentences that had no opinion in them, the date, the time, Stuart Pruitt's presence, and his movements, the 2 customer conversations, the sales figures compared to the previous 3 Saturdays. She wrote it down because documentation was what stood between a thing that happened and a thing that could be demonstrated to have happened. Then she called Darlene Cobb. Darlene answered on the second ring. What she said in the first 30 seconds told Nora something she had not expected to hear. Darlene said that a man named Stuart Pruitt had come to see her at her farm 2 weeks earlier. She said that he had been pleasant and had asked about how things were going, and had eventually, with the careful indirection of someone who has practiced the approach, offered her a modest sum of money to have a conversation with Nora as a neighbor who was concerned about the practical difficulties Nora was facing, to encourage her to think seriously about her options before the situation got worse. Not to threaten, not to pressure, just to speak as a neighbor from a place of genuine concern, which Pruitt had presented as something he was asking Darlene to do because he himself was concerned and lacked the personal relationship with Nora that would make such a conversation natural. Darlene said she had told him she would think about it. She had not told Nora at the time because she had not decided what she was going to do. And then she had been at the farmer's market that morning, not at the market itself, but at the hardware store across the street. And she had seen Pruitt working his way along the vendor row from the sidewalk, and she had watched him, and she had decided. She said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you before." Nora was quiet for a moment. She said, "You're telling me now." She drove to Darlene's house that evening. They sat on the porch in the cooling air of the late August evening, and Darlene told her everything Pruitt had said, and Nora wrote it down, and they drank iced tea and watched the light drain out of the sky and the first stars come out, and Nora felt something she had not expected to feel, which was not anger and not vindication, but something simpler and harder to name. The specific gratitude of a person who discovers that the world, which has been showing her primarily its unfriendliness, contains someone who chose when it came to the moment to be decent. "He picked the wrong person to approach," Nora said. Darlene said, "I know he did. I've known Harriet's family for 30 years. They stayed on the porch until the stars were fully out." Nora drove home along the farm road with the windows down and the night air coming in cool from the fields, and thought about what the conversation had given her. Not just the information, the exact specifics of what Pruitt had asked Darlene to do and say, which she could document and add to the locked drawer, but something harder to quantify, the knowledge that the campaign against her had a face and a name and a structure, that it was not the ambient pressure of difficult circumstances pressing in from every direction, but a deliberate effort organized by people who had decided she was a problem to be managed, which meant that everything she had been interpreting as bad luck or the natural resistance of a difficult situation was at least in part something more purposeful. This was not frightening, it was clarifying. She drove home and sat at the kitchen table and opened the ledger and wrote down what she now knew in the same declarative factual sentences she had always used, because the discipline of plain description was what kept her from turning information into a story about herself that was more dramatic than useful. The facts were enough. She did not need them to be more than they were to understand what they meant. She knew that Pruitt had approached Darlene. She knew he had tried the farmer's market. She knew that Roy Tanner had come to the farm under circumstances that, when placed alongside what Darlene had told her, were no longer ambiguous. She did not yet know how those pieces connected to Hargrove and Sons directly, whether Pruitt was a contractor or an intermediary, or simply someone who had taken it upon himself to assist in ways he thought would be welcomed. But she knew enough to understand the shape of what had been happening and to anticipate the shape of what was likely to happen next. She fell asleep that night with the ledger still open on the kitchen table, the lamp on the farm quiet around her, and in the morning she got up and went out to check the coal frames in the gray early light, and then came back inside and made coffee and looked at what she had written the night before and added 3 more lines that had come to her in the night observations about sequence and timing that she wanted to have on record before she forgot the clarity of the feeling that had accompanied them. She had been on the farm for 2.5 years. She had documented approximately 400 separate observations, decisions, events, and measurements. She had spent those years believing that the documentation was what she was building toward, that the accumulation of evidence was the plan itself. Standing in the kitchen with her coffee in the early morning of a third-year September, she understood something she had not quite understood before, that the documentation was not the plan. It was the foundation. The plan was what she was going to do when the moment came that required a foundation. She did not know yet exactly what the plan was, but she understood now that she had been building it the whole time without knowing that was what she was doing. The way the seep built itself in the deep clay formations year by year, pressure by pressure, invisible at the surface, reshaping the underground in the direction it was always going to go. The letter from Roy Tanner arrived at the farm 3 weeks later. It came on the bank's letterhead, a single-page formal and precise in the way of legal communications that have been reviewed by someone whose job is to make things say exactly what they intend to say and nothing more. It informed her that in light of material changes to the environmental and commercial character of land adjacent to the collateral property securing her agricultural loan, the bank was initiating a review of the current loan-to-asset ratio and would be in contact regarding possible documentation requirements or adjusted terms. It was signed by Roy Tanner in his capacity as Senior Agricultural Lending Officer. She read it standing at the kitchen counter. She set it down on the counter and looked at it for a moment, and then picked it up and read it again carefully, looking for the specific clauses in her inherited loan agreement that would give the bank the right to do what the letter was describing. She had read the loan agreement twice before, once when she took over the account, and once after Roy Tanner's first visit to the farm, and she had a reasonable understanding of what those environmental change clauses actually said and what they required to be invoked. She got in her truck. She drove to the bank. Roy Tanner did not expect her. His office door was open, and she walked past the receptionist with the purposeful movement of someone who knows where she is going, and by the time the receptionist had processed what was happening and started to say something, Nora was already at Tanner's door. He stood up when she walked in. He was a man who stood up for things she had noticed that on his farm visit, and she filed it as information about the kind of person he had been trained to present as. He gestured to the chair across the desk. He smiled with the professional warmth of someone who had been in an uncomfortable position before and knew that the warmth was the first tool you reach for. She sat down. She put the letter on the desk between them, facing him. She said, "I want to understand the basis for this review." He explained it. The same points he had touched on during his farm visit, the environmental change provisions in the loan agreement, the bank's right to reassess collateral value when the adjacent land use changed materially, the standard practice during periods of significant nearby development. All of it technically accurate, all of it technically within the framework the loan agreement provided. She asked him when he had most recently visited the Hargrove and Sons distribution facility adjacent to her property. He looked at her. He said he was not sure what she meant. She asked him whether he held any financial interest in Hargrove and Sons development personally, or through any entity with which he was associated, including investment vehicles, partnership arrangements, or consulting relationships. The expression on his face was the expression of a careful man who has just realized that the conversation he had prepared for is not the conversation he is having, and that the gap between the two is significant. She watched him go through the options: denial, deflection, anger, counter-questioning. She watched him choose. He said he was not going to discuss his personal financial arrangements. She said she understood. She picked up her phone, which she had been holding in her lap since sitting down, and she pressed play on the recording application she had opened before walking into the bank. She let it run for approximately 15 seconds, enough for him to hear the quality of the audio and enough for him to hear his own voice from the beginning of their current conversation, the part where he had been explaining the environmental change provisions to her. She pressed stop. She put the phone in her jacket pocket. She said, "I'm going to drive back to my farm and tend to my crops. I would appreciate it if this review process moved through normal channels and on the timeline that applies to routine reviews without any acceleration." She stood up. She extended her hand. He shook it because he was a man who had been trained to shake hands and because he was working out what he was facing, and in the meantime, his body was doing what it knew to do. She walked out. She drove back to the farm. She documented the meeting in the ledger. She planted her fall cover crop in the northern beds, winter rye and crimson clover, the way Harriet had always done in September, because the cover crop was going in the ground regardless of everything else. It was the second week of October in the autumn of the second year that she found the footprints. She had gone out before dawn to check the cold frames, the same routine she had kept since her first season, moving through the dark with the flashlight, checking the temperature readings inside each frame, looking for condensation issues or any sign of frost penetration. She was coming back along the western edge of the garden when the flashlight caught something in the soft soil of the low field, the field that had been wetter than normal all of autumn, the field where the soil color had been subtly different for the past several weeks in a way she had been watching carefully. Two sets of boot prints, one larger than the other by a shoe size or so, which meant two people. They had come in from the property line on the western side through the gap in the old fence near the corner that she had been meaning to repair, and they had crossed the low field diagonally and stopped in the wet spot, the particular patch of ground that had been consistently wetter than the rest of the field since August, and then they had gone back the way they came. She crouched at the edge of the impressions. The prints were several days old, softened by a light rain, but still clearly legible. The stopping point was exact. Whoever had come had walked directly to the wet spot, as if they had a specific destination in mind, rather than wandering, and had stopped there for long enough to do something deliberate. She could see in the soft ground at the center of the stopping point 3 small circular depressions, evenly spaced, each about 1.5 inches in diameter. The depression pattern of a soil core sampling tool. Someone had come onto her land in the night and taken soil samples from the wet spot in the low western field. She stood up and looked across the field at the eastern fence line, at the orange glow of the distribution center's floodlights above the elderberry shrubs she had planted along the fence in the spring, which were now knee-high and would not be tall enough to matter for years yet. She felt the cold clarity of a suspicion confirmed. She photographed the prints with her phone. She measured the stride length and the shoe size of both sets. She photographed the soil core impressions and measured their diameter and spacing. She wrote all of it in the ledger when she got back to the house with timestamps. She had been considering since the beginning whether Hargrove and Sons had known what was under the eastern land when they chose to build there. The unsigned note in Harriet's notebook suggested someone had known about the seep and had tried to keep that knowledge from going public years before Hargrove's project was announced. A development company of Hargrove's scale, before committing to a project of that size, would have done subsurface geological assessments as standard due diligence. The footprints suggested they were still watching, that whatever they were looking for underground, they had not stopped looking for it, that the wet spot in her western field had drawn their attention the same way it had drawn hers. The full answer came in a county courthouse in February. In November of the second year, Hargrove and Sons had filed a legal complaint against her. The complaint was narrow. She had placed a temporary wooden barrier across a gravel access path at the southeastern corner of her property line, a path that she had confirmed through her own survey was on her land, but that Hargrove claimed their contractors had been using as a secondary access route under an informal historical easement. They wanted the barrier removed. They wanted an order preventing similar interference in the future. She had placed the barrier deliberately. She had watched the path used repeatedly by Hargrove equipment without notice or permission, and she had placed the barrier knowing it was likely to provoke a formal response because she had wanted Hargrove to respond in a venue where the response would be on the public record. She retained the land use attorney from Lexington, who had been recommended by the Extension Office, a careful woman named Patricia Ewell, who had reviewed Hargrove's land use agreements thoroughly before the hearing. The hearing was in early February. Hargrove's attorney was efficient and confident and introduced his supporting materials in a logical sequence: property surveys, historical use documentation, contractor records. Among the supporting materials, filed with the same matter-of-fact efficiency as the survey documents, was a geological assessment report. Patricia Ewell requested copies of all submitted documents as a matter of standard procedure, which Hargrove's attorney provided without hesitation, because the geological report was in the file as background support and had not been introduced as a significant piece of evidence. It was to him a formality. The court dismissed Hargrove's complaint. The path was on Nora's land. There was no historical easement. She was permitted to maintain the barrier. That evening at the kitchen table, she read the geological assessment report from beginning to end. It had been commissioned by Hargrove and Sons before construction began, conducted by a geotechnical consulting firm, and it described three subsurface features of geological interest on the eastern parcel. The first was a clay lens at a depth of approximately 12 feet, with bearing capacity implications for the foundation design. The second was a seasonal high water table in the northeast corner of the parcel. The third was a mineral-rich clay seep described as an active surface water emergence point in the low area of the northeast quadrant, with elevated iron and magnesium content, consistent with deep formation mineralization. The report was dated 3 years before construction began. Hargrove had known about the seep before they broke ground. They had identified it, characterized it, and built anyway, which meant they had decided that the presence of a mineral seep on the northeastern corner of their parcel was not a reason to reconsider the project, perhaps because they had assessed the seep as commercially irrelevant to their purposes, which it was a distribution center does not require mineral-rich groundwater, or perhaps because they had assessed that the construction would simply bury it. They had not considered or had not cared what the disruption might do to the underlying hydrology of the adjacent property. She put the geological report in a folder. She put the folder in the locked drawer of Harriet's old desk alongside the original notice and Roy Tanner's letter and her own documentation. She went to bed. The winter of the third year was the longest of the three. In January, the news came through the feed co-op Darlene Cobb had sold her property to Hargrove and Sons. The sale had closed quietly the way sales close when both parties want discretion. The acreage would be incorporated into the mixed-use hospitality and retail campuses that Hargrove had now publicly announced an expansion of the original distribution hub into something intended to draw regional visitors, the kind of development that rebrands a stretch of countryside as a destination. Nora stood in the feed co-op parking lot and held her phone and felt the weight of that land in her chest. Darlene had not called, had not mentioned it during the 2 times they had spoken in December, had sold to the company that had been systematically trying to displace Nora for 2 years and had done it quietly and had not thought it necessary to say anything. She drove home. She did not call Darlene. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time and then made dinner and went to bed. And in the morning she was, if not fine, then functional, because she had learned through 2 full years of this to sort the things that mattered from the things that were useful and to work from the second category even when the first category was very heavy. She did call Darlene eventually, 3 days later on a Sunday evening when the work of the week was done and she had no more reason to delay it. The phone rang 4 times before Darlene answered, and the hesitation in her voice when she said hello told Nora that Darlene had been watching the caller name on her screen and deciding whether to pick up. She had picked up. That was something. Nora did not ask her to explain herself. She understood more than Darlene likely knew the mechanics of what Hargrove did with its money and its people. She understood that an offer made to a woman in her 60s with 300 acres of land and no children and a farm that was increasingly hemmed in on 2 sides by commercial development was a different kind of offer than the one made to a 22-year-old with nothing to lose. She understood that Darlene had a different arithmetic to work a different version of what staying or leaving meant at that age in that position. She did not say any of this out loud. Some things once named become walls between people instead of bridges. She said, "I understand why you made the decision you made." Darlene was quiet on the other end for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't think it would affect your water." Nora said it might not. It was not quite a lie and not quite the truth, which was the most honest thing she could say about a situation that she herself did not fully understand yet. What she knew was that Darlene's 300 acres to the west represented another layer of disturbed ground between her property and the agricultural water table that had been feeding the farm for 50 years, and that what that disturbance would do was something she would not know for another season at least, and that expressing that uncertainty to Darlene in this moment would accomplish nothing except to make Darlene feel worse about a decision that was already made. They spoke for another 15 minutes. Darlene asked about the farm. Nora told her what she could honestly tell her, which was that the third year was showing signs she had been waiting for, that the western field was doing something worth watching, that she was being careful and patient and thorough, and that she believed the farm was going to be all right. Darlene listened in the way of someone who wants to believe something and is choosing to. Before they hung up, Darlene said she hoped Nora was right about the water. There was a weight in it, something that lived between regret and hope, and Nora held it in her chest for a while after she set the phone down. She went out to the western field in the January cold. The ground was hard and iron gray under the pale winter sky, and the bare elderberry branches along the eastern fence made their particular winter architecture against the flood-lit orange haze that hung above the distribution center at all hours. She stood in the low corner where the wet spot had held through November and crouched down and pressed her fingers into the soil. It was frozen solid at the surface, but an inch below the surface, the ground gave slightly the specific give of soil that has more subsurface moisture than the freeze can reach. She stood up. She walked back to the house. She started the third-year ledger on a new page. Leonard Colgate drove out to the farm for the second time that January. The first visit had been in the early autumn, shortly after she had walked out of Roy Tanner's office at the bank. A visit she had not expected, and that had arrived in the form of a politely worded card in her mailbox, asking whether she would be willing to meet with the project development team from Hargrove and Sons to discuss the adjacency impacts of the construction on her operation. She had not responded to the card. She had filed it in the locked drawer. The January visit came without a card. Colgate appeared at her gate on a Tuesday morning when the sky was low and gray, and the temperature was in the low 20s, which she took as either confidence or desperation. She did not invite him inside. She met him at the gate with her barn coat and her rubber boots and the patient expression of someone who has plenty of time. He was pleasant. He was always pleasant. It was one of the things she had come to understand about Leonard Colgate, who was the pleasant public face of a company that used pleasantness the way some people use fences to mark a boundary while pretending to be neighborly. He told her that Hargrove and Sons was deeply committed to being a good neighbor in Harlan County. He told her the company was aware that the construction and the operational footprint of the distribution center had created real challenges for adjacent properties. He told her the company had been discussing programs of direct compensation for neighboring land who had experienced documented impacts, and that he wanted to explore whether such a program might apply in her situation. She looked at him for a moment. The wind came across the eastern field and moved through the hawthorn along the fence. She asked him how much. He named a number. It was not an insulting number. It was, in fact, a reasonable number by the standards of what the land had been worth before any of this had begun, by the standards of Marcus Webb's original comp sheet, by the standards of the world in which she had inherited the farm 3 years ago and did not yet know what it contained. It was a number size for the farm that the farm had been. She said, "That number reflects what this land was worth before you redirected the water table." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has not expected the specific sentence he has just heard. She watched him process it. She watched him look at the farm, at the fields at the low western corner where the winter brown grass of the seeped surface drainage was visible even through the frost. She said, "I'll be in touch when I'm ready to talk." She turned and walked back to the house. She heard him stand at the gate for another few seconds, and then she heard him walk back to his car and drive away. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and thought about what it meant that Hargrove had come back with a compensation offer 2.5 years into the process, after the bank pressure, after Stuart Pruitt at the farmer's market, after Darlene's sale. She thought about the geological report in the locked drawer, the one that showed the company had known about the eastern mineral seep before they broke ground. She thought about the particular meaning of a compensation offer that arrives before the person being compensated fully understands what they are being compensated for. Darlene's land was gone. What was useful was the western field. The western field had been quietly working through the winter in ways that the frozen surface concealed, but that showed themselves when she looked carefully. The wet spot that had appeared in late summer had not dried out. In January, with the rest of the low field frozen solid, the wet spot remained soft at its center, the ground around it damp and slightly warm, in a way that deep source water can keep ground unfrozen even in cold weather. She tested the water that was pooling at its surface in November. The mineral content was elevated higher than the creek, higher than any surface water source she had ever tested on the property. Not dramatically elevated, but the numbers had moved in the direction she was watching for. She sent a second sample to the University Extension Lab. She waited. By April of the fourth year, the seep was visible to the eye. A small trickle of water emerging from the low ground of the western corner of the field, running for perhaps 20 feet across the surface before it disappeared into the soil and the grass roots. It smelled faintly of iron and sulfur, the same mineral signature she recognized from Harriet's descriptions in the notebook, the smell of water that has been in contact with deep ferrous formations. The smell of the eastern seep relocated. She crouched at the edge of it. She put her fingers in the water and held them there in the cold spring morning, feeling the slight warmth that deep source groundwater carries, the warmth of the earth itself at depth. The bees were flying in the morning light over the western field. She watched one land at the edge of the water and drink. Then she stood up and walked to the house and called the laboratory in Lexington and told them she had a new sample that required full mineral characterization and that she needed the results as quickly as they could turn them around. She stood at the kitchen table with the sample jar in her hands and felt the farm under her feet and thought about Harriet following bees at dawn through 8 years of careful seasons, about the slanted handwriting in the notebooks, about the unsigned note, and the geological report in the locked drawer, about Roy Tanner's face when she had played the recording back at him about the stumps of the windbreak trees, about Darlene's silence, and about the question she had been holding since the night she first read the notebook, whether she was right or wrong, whether this was real or whether she had been telling herself a story she needed to be true. She was about to find out. The results came back from Lexington in 22 days, a full mineral profile from the laboratory at the University Agricultural Extension Service. She read them standing at the mailbox at the end of the farm road in the late afternoon light, with the spring wind moving through the elderberry along the eastern fence. Magnesium elevated significantly above baseline for surface water in the region. Calcium elevated. Selenium trace, but present in a form the lab noted was consistent with deep subsurface sourcing. Iron compounds, an unusual combination of ferrous and ferric fractions that the lab commented on, specifically noting that the profile was atypical for surface water in the region and consistent with mineralization from a deep clay formation. The same profile Harriet had described. The same minerals the bees had been finding for 8 years on the eastern land. The seep had redirected. She folded the lab report. She put it in the inside pocket of her jacket close to her chest, in the way you carry something that is both a relief and a gravity. She walked back to the house. She stopped on the porch and looked west across the farm toward the low field where the seep was running, and then east toward the floodlights of the distribution center, visible above the elderberry, which was shoulder high now and coming into bud. She thought about the geological report in the locked drawer. She thought about what it meant that Hargrove had known about the seep from the beginning. She thought about what it would mean when she was ready to show that document to the right people in the right context with everything else she had built around it. She was not ready yet, but she was close. She went inside. She put the lab report in the locked drawer beside the geological report and Roy Tanner's letter and the original notice and the unsigned note. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table and opened a new notebook, one she had bought for herself at the county seat hardware store, with a plain cover and wide ruled pages, and she wrote at the top of the first page in her own handwriting, which was less slanted than Harriet's and less compressed. Year 4, the water came. She sat with that for a moment in the quiet kitchen, with the spring evening coming down outside, and the seep running in the low field, and the bees home in their hives, and she permitted herself to feel what she felt, which was not triumph and not relief, but something older and quieter than either of those things, the particular satisfaction of a person who has been serious and has waited and has been proved right about what seriousness was for. She planted her spring crops. She planted the most mineral-sensitive heirloom varieties directly in the low western field near the seep. Cherokee purple tomatoes, dragon tongue beans, a dry bean variety called speckled purple hull that Harriet had kept in the seed library for 20 years, and that had never yielded the way the notebook said it should. She planted them in the wet ground of the western field, and she waited for August to tell her if she was right about what the water was going to do. She did not wait alone. There was the lab report, and there was the university researcher, a soil scientist from the UK Extension Service, who had read the results and driven down to see the seep in person, spending 4 hours on the property in May, crouching in the low ground and taking his own samples, and going away shaking his head in the precise manner of a scientist who has found something he did not expect. There was the formal hydrological assessment she commissioned from him afterward, a document that described the subsurface geology in technical language that she did not fully understand, but that said in its essential conclusion what she already knew. The seep was the same source as the eastern seep, redirected by the disturbance of construction, and its mineral profile was unusual and documented and real. She filed the hydrological assessment in the locked drawer. She added it to the stack that was building there quietly, one document at a time, like a foundation being laid under something that was not yet visible from the surface. And she began to prepare for what came after August. The tomatoes came up in the third week of August, and the morning she picked the first one, she stood in the western field, with it warm in her palm for a full minute before she bit into it. She had grown the Cherokee purple variety for 3 seasons running. She knew it the way you know something you have cared for through repetition, not as a surprise, but as a reliable and recognizable thing. Its specific brightness and its specific acidity, and the way the sweetness came through when you allowed it to ripen fully on the vine. She knew its texture against her thumb. She knew the particular way the juice ran. She had grown it in the same soil for 3 years, and it had been good solidly, good the kind of good that earned its price at the farmer's market and brought people back. What she tasted when she bit into it was not what she knew. The brightness was still there. The acidity was there. But beneath those qualities behind them, there was something that had not been there before, something mineral and persistent and complex, that she recognized not intellectually but physically, in the way the taste sat in the back of her mouth and continued past the swallowing, a quality she had no single precise word for, but that she recognized immediately as the taste of the water she had been testing and documenting for 4 years, arriving now in the fruit itself translated by the plant from geology into flavor. Not louder, not more intense in the way of something artificially amplified, deeper, more completely itself, as if the tomato had finally become the thing it had always been trying to be. She stood in the low field with the half-eaten tomato in her hand and looked at the vine and at the seep running clear and slow 30 yards away, and then she stood there for another minute, just standing, because some things are worth the full minute. Then she went inside and called Sybil Oakes. Sybil was a specialty produce broker working out of Nashville, a woman in her mid-40s with a precise and unhurried manner, and a client list that read like a short list of the most particular and well-funded restaurant groups operating in the Mid-South. She had reached out to Nora 8 months earlier, not through any action of Nora's own, but through the ambient intelligence of the specialty food world, which is a small world that communicates efficiently. A chef in Nashville had tasted one of Nora's early speckled purple hull beans at a farmer's market and had mentioned it to 2 other people. Those 2 people had mentioned it to others. Sybil had heard the name twice in a week and had called. They had spoken twice by phone, careful conversations in which Nora had shared information about the farm, strategically aware that Sybil was a professional who had interests of her own and whose enthusiasm, genuine as it seemed, existed in the context of a business she was running. Nora had been interested but not rushed. She had told Sybil she would be in touch when she had something worth sending, and she had kept that promise. That afternoon, she packed a sample box with the thoroughness of someone who understands that first impressions in specialty food markets are not easily revised. 12 Cherokee purple tomatoes, selected for uniformity of ripeness. 2 varieties of heirloom cucumber from the western field beds. A half pint of the current summer honey from the hives that had reestablished themselves near the seep. A small jar of the dried culinary herbs she grew in the northern beds. With the produce, she included the most recent lab results for the western seep water and a 1-page summary she had written herself plainly, without marketing language describing what the mineral profile was and where it came from and what she believed it was doing to the flavor of the food. Sybil called back in 48 hours. She had tasted the tomatoes first the way a serious food person tastes things carefully and without distraction. She said she had tasted a great many tomatoes over 20 years of working in this business. She said these were not like other tomatoes. She asked how much Nora could supply for the remainder of the fall season. She placed an order that afternoon for the entire standing crop, everything Nora had in the ground that had not already been sold at a price per pound that was nearly 3 times Nora's farmer's market price. And she said she would want to discuss the following season before October was out. Nora wrote the number in the ledger. She looked at it for a moment with the particular steadiness of someone who has been waiting a long time for a number and is determined not to let the relief of seeing it collapse her discipline. Then she called Patricia Ewell, her land use attorney in Lexington. She said she needed to start a water rights registration process and that she wanted it completed before the end of the calendar year. Patricia said she could do that. It was an administrative process relatively straightforward if the documentation supporting the water feature was solid, which based on what she had seen from Nora's files, it clearly was. The registration went through in October without complication. A formal recognition of the surface water emergence on the western property, logged with the County Water Resources Office, supported by the hydrological assessment and the lab results and the university extension documentation. A routine filing, the kind of thing that only matters when something else happens later. She filed the registration certificate in the locked drawer. She did not mention it to Sybil. She did not tell Patricia what she intended to do with it. She added it to the stack, which was now 5 documents deep, and she waited for what was coming. She did not wait passively. In October and November of that 5th year, she worked the farm with the particular intensity of someone who understands that preparation and waiting are not opposites, but the same activity viewed from different angles. She harvested the fall root crops from the western beds and documented the yields in the flavor evaluations in a new section of the ledger bomb, building the kind of record that speaks for itself when the time comes to show it to people who need to be shown things. She expanded the trial plantings to include 2 additional heirloom varieties she had been holding in the seed library, putting them in the low western corner nearest the seep, where the soil had been receiving the mineral-rich water for 1 full growing cycle and would have another winter to absorb it before the next growing season. She winterized the cold frames and cleaned the seed house and labeled the new catalog entries in the order Harriet had always used. Variety name and collection date and source and any note about yield or flavor or germination behavior that the season had given her. She also, in the first week of November, drove to the county courthouse in Harlan and spent 4 hours in the records room working through land use filings. She had not been inside that building since her first months on the farm, when she had gone to understand the county's land use history before she understood why understanding it mattered. She was a different person now in that records room than the 22-year-old who had first walked in with no clear plan and a feeling that the answers to something were in the documents somewhere if she could find the right ones. She knew now what she was looking for, which made everything faster, and she also knew that what she was looking for was likely to be there, which made the search less a question than a confirmation of what she already believed. She had not gone back there since the discovery of the geological report, the accidental disclosure in Hargrove's own legal filing that had told her the company had known about the eastern mineral seep before they broke ground. She had kept that document in the locked drawer for 3 years, carrying the weight of it, carrying what it meant about the calculation Hargrove had made that the seep was worth knowing about and filing away and not telling her. She had never decided exactly what to do with it, only that she would know when the moment was right. What she was looking for in November was the history of the eastern land before Hargrove bought it. She had the geological report. She wanted to know whether there were other filings, other documentation, a longer paper trail that would show the company's knowledge of the subsurface hydrology was not accidental or incidental but deliberate and material to their development decisions. She spent 4 hours finding it, working through deed transfers and environmental assessments and the permit filings that preceded construction, and what she assembled in her notebook at the courthouse table was not dramatic. Not a smoking document, but something quieter and more durable. A consistent pattern of geological awareness in every filing the company had made, and an awareness that had never once been disclosed to the adjacent property owner, who stood to be most directly affected by what the construction would do to the shared water table. She drove home with a notebook on the passenger seat. She made dinner and ate alone at the kitchen table and thought about the patterns she had documented, about how much she would need and when she would use it. She thought about the offer Leonard Colgate had brought to her gate in January. She thought about the version of that offer that would come again when Hargrove was ready to pursue the hospitality campus and needed what she had built. She thought about her grandmother following bees at dawn across 8 years of careful seasons, writing down what she found in notebooks that no one else had ever read, building the foundation for something she would not live to see completed. She thought about the unsigned note tucked into the geological notebook, the one she had never been able to trace, the warning from someone who had known what Hargrove knew and had wanted at least one other person to know it too. There was a kind of long patience in this farm, she thought, not just in her. In the ground itself, holding the water in the deep clay formations through decades of surface changes, redistributing it according to pressures that operated on geologic time, indifferent to property lines and development timelines and the particular anxieties of the humans living above it. The seep had been there before Harriet. It would be there after Nora. What she was doing was not winning against the land or against Hargrove, but aligning herself with what the land was already doing, which was the only kind of winning that lasts. She washed her dishes. She went to the shelf and took down Harriet's notebook, the one labeled simply "What the Bees Know." And she read the section she had read a dozen times before, the pages where Harriet had first identified the seep, had traced the bees to the eastern land at dawn, had mapped the mineral water source with the methodical attention of a person who had learned to pay attention by doing it every day for 50 years. She read it the way you read something that is no longer new information, but still has weight, the way you reread a letter from someone gone to find not something you missed, but the presence itself, the evidence of a particular mind working through a particular problem in its particular way. She put the notebook back. She checked the seep in the low field by flashlight, a nightly ritual in November when the ground moved between freeze and thaw, and the water flow could change overnight. It was running, a thin, bright thread of it in the flashlight beam, iron smell rising in the cold air, moving across the low field toward the drainage ditch she had dug in the third year to give it a channel rather than let it spread into the root zone of the winter cover crop. She crouched at the edge of it and held her fingers in the water for a moment, feeling the subsurface warmth that the deep source carried even in November. And then she stood up and walked back to the house. She did not know exactly what form it would take or when it would arrive. She knew it was coming. Warren Finch arrived on a Saturday in late October. He had driven up from Nashville in a truck that was dusty from 4 hours of two-lane roads because Sybil Oakes had mentioned the Aldrich farm to him twice in the same week, and he had learned over 30 years of food writing that when Sybil mentioned something twice, it was worth investigating in person. He was 62 years old with the quality of attention that belongs to someone who has been paying close attention to things for a long time and has stopped needing to announce it. He arrived without ceremony, introduced himself at the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, and did not ask for a tour so much as indicate his readiness to follow wherever she chose to take him. She took him through the seed house first because the seed house was the foundation of everything. And she had learned that showing people the seed house before showing them anything else was the clearest possible statement of what the farm actually was. The shelves ran from floor to ceiling along 3 walls labeled envelopes and sealed glass jars arranged in the taxonomic order Harriet had established, each one dated and annotated in the catalog Nora had been building for 4 years from Harriet's original records. 241 varieties. The collection of a life's work. He walked the shelves slowly reading labels. He did not say much. She watched him understand what he was looking at. Then she showed him the water test results and the hydrological assessment, explaining the seep and its origin as directly as she could without the kind of self-conscious framing that people sometimes use when they are afraid their listener will find the story too convenient or too dramatic. It was what it was. She said it plainly. She showed him Harriet's notebook, the one labeled "What the Bees Know," open to the pages with the foraging maps and the underlined notation. Then she walked him to the western field. She picked a Cherokee purple off the vine and handed it to him without saying anything. He bit into it and stopped walking. He stood in the field with a half-eaten tomato in his hand and looked at it with the expression of someone who has just been surprised by something in a way they did not expect to be surprised, and then he looked at her. He said, "How long has it been like this?" She said, "This variety this season. The water shifted 4 years ago." He took out a small notebook and a pen and asked if he could take notes. She said yes. He spent 4 hours at the farm. He tasted everything she allowed. He asked careful and intelligent questions. The questions of someone who understood that the story he was encountering was not simply an agricultural story or a food story, but a geological story. A story about what happens when the earth is disturbed, and the disturbance reveals something that was always there but hidden. He understood the terroir concept not as a marketing term, but as a scientific reality. And he knew how rarely it could be documented with the kind of evidence she was able to show him. Before he left, standing at his truck in the late afternoon light with his notebook in his hand, he told her he wanted to write a long feature. Not a farm profile, not a recipe piece, not the kind of thing food magazines usually did with interesting small producers. A serious piece, the kind of thing that required several months of reporting about what the concept of terroir actually meant in American vegetable farming, why it had been almost entirely ignored compared to its centrality in wine culture, and why the Aldrich farm was the most compelling and best documented example he had ever personally encountered. He asked if she would cooperate with the piece. She said she would with one condition. The geological history of the eastern lands, specifically the Hargrove Survey report, and its documentation of the original seep was not to be included until she gave explicit permission. She had plans for that material, and she was not ready to use it publicly. He agreed without pressing her to explain why. He drove away. She watched the dust settle behind his truck on the farm road, and then walked to the low field and checked the seep in the last light of the day, running steady and clear as it had been running since the fourth year. And she thought about everything she had built since the morning she found the first notice, and she thought it was almost time. The article ran the following February in a national food magazine, a long piece nearly 5,000 words that described the farm and the seep in Harriet's notebooks and the behavior of the bees and the particular flavor of the Cherokee purple in language that was precise and technically rigorous, and also in the way of the best food writing, genuinely beautiful. The title was The Girl Who Stayed in the Land That Remembered. Nora read it at the kitchen table on the Tuesday morning. It arrived in the mail with her coffee and with the early light coming through the east-facing window. Then she put it down and went to check the seep. The advanced copies of the article had circulated in food media circles before the magazine reached newsstands, and the people who inhabit those circles communicate at a speed that print schedules cannot contain. Within 3 weeks of publication, she had received contact from restaurant groups in Nashville, Louisville, and Atlanta, from a specialty grocery operation in Chicago, from a documentary production company in New York that wanted to discuss a film about the farm, from a seed preservation nonprofit based in Vermont that had been tracking heirloom varieties in private collections for 20 years and wanted to partner on the full documentation of Harriet's seed library, from the University of Kentucky Agricultural Program, which wanted to conduct a formal hydrological study of the Western seep's relationship to the farm's soil profile. She answered each inquiry methodically in the evenings after the farm work was done, working through the list the way she worked through everything with care and without rushing in the language she had developed over 4 years of learning how to be taken seriously without performing the taking seriously. Some of the inquiries she answered with a yes. Some she answered with a not yet, which was her way of saying she was interested but not ready. Some she answered with a polite no that contained no apology, and required none because she had learned over 5 years that the ability to decline without explaining yourself was the same muscle as the ability to sit day when people told you to leave the same muscle she had been developing since the morning she read the notice at the fence post, and folded it carefully and went inside to finish her coffee. The documentary production company she told to call back in 2 years when she would have more to show them, and when the supply agreement she expected to be finalizing would be far enough along that its disclosure would not complicate the negotiation. They noted the timeline. They called back. The university agricultural program she said yes to immediately because what the university researchers would do was the one thing she could not fully do, herself generate the kind of institutional scientific documentation that would give the hydrological story a credibility that personal lab results and an independent consultant's assessment, however thorough, could not entirely provide. A team from Lexington drove out in March and spent a full week on the property, taking subsurface samples at multiple points across the western field and at the seep emergence coring soil at 20-foot intervals through the low ground, measuring water table depth and flow direction across the property. They were quiet and methodical in the way of people who are genuinely interested in a problem, and she left them alone to do their work the way she would want to be left alone to do hers. Their preliminary findings, which they shared with her before they left, were more complete than she had expected. They confirmed the connection between the eastern disturbance and the western seep emergence, traced the approximate subsurface pathway that the water was following through the clay formation, and estimated based on the current flow rate and the surface area of the mineral emergence that the feature was stable and self-sustaining on the subsurface hydrology she had been documenting for 3 years. They also found in the soil samples from the western field evidence of mineral enrichment that extended significantly further across the field than the visible seep itself, suggesting that the subsurface water was percolating across a broader area than the surface trickle implied, feeding the root zone of a much larger portion of the field than she had been cultivating on the basis of the visible water. She sat with the preliminary findings for 2 evenings before she expanded her spring planting plan to cover the full enrichment zone the soil samples suggested. She had been conservative, planting only what she could directly observe. Now she had the scientific basis to be less conservative. The seed preservation nonprofit she said yes to with specific conditions. She wanted the partnership focused not on the nationally recognized varieties in the collection, the ones that had made it into published seed catalogs and that other collectors were already preserving, but on the uncommon and undocumented ones that Harriet had collected from sources she had noted in her catalogs as individual farmers, roadside stands, kitchen gardeners, and agricultural extension agents she had known in her decades of farming. These were the varieties for which the Aldrich Farms collection might be the last or one of the last remaining stocks, and these were the ones that needed the most urgent attention. The nonprofit agreed. A representative came down from Vermont in late March, a woman named Frances Howell, who moved through the seed house the way Nora had come to move through it herself, with the particular reverence of someone who understands that what they are looking at is irreplaceable. They spent 2 days together in the seed house going through the catalog, and Frances Howell left with a list of 63 varieties she was prioritizing for the partnership, and left behind a letter of commitment that went in the locked drawers alongside the growing stack of documents that constituted the story of what the Aldrich farm was. It was in the first week of April, and the same morning Nora was preparing to start the spring greenhouse seeding, that the letter came in the plain white envelope. She saw the return address and set it on the kitchen table and made coffee before she opened it. She did not want to read it in a hurry. She set it on the kitchen table and made coffee before she opened it. She did not want to read it in a hurry. The letter was from Leonard Colgate, writing now in his capacity as Vice President of Development Strategy for Hargrove & Sons. The language was polished and professionally careful in the way of communications, drafted by someone with legal counsel involved in the drafting. He explained that Hargrove was developing an expansion of the campus adjacent to the distribution center, a mixed-use development with retail, hospitality, and cultural components intended to establish the site as a regional destination. The brand positioning of the expansion, he explained, was centered on authentic regional identity and the genuine character of the place. He wondered if Nora might be open to discussing a partnership opportunity. She read it twice. She set it down. She looked out the kitchen window at the eastern fence line where the hawthorn and elderberry she had planted 5 years ago were dense and 12 feet tall and interlocked in a living wall that moved slightly in the April wind. The birds in them, the bees working the elderflower buds, the floodlights of the distribution center invisible behind them. She thought about this morning she had found the first notice stapled to the fence post. She thought about Leonard Colgate in his yellow hard hat with his practiced warmth and his pamphlet. She thought about Roy Tanner's face and the recording in the locked drawer. She thought about the geological report. She thought about the stumps. She picked up her phone and called Patricia Ewell. She said, "Hargrove wants to meet." Patricia said, "When?" She said, "Give me 6 weeks." In those 6 weeks, she was methodical in the specific way of someone who has been preparing for something for a long time and knows that the preparation is now concluding. She researched Hargrove's campus expansion plans through the public planning documents that had been filed with the county, reading the architectural concept documents and the projected visitor numbers and the brand positioning materials that development companies filed with planning boards and that most people never thought to read. She found in those documents the thing she had suspected: the campus expansion's entire identity concept was built on the idea of authentic local agricultural heritage. The kind of story that needed a real farm with a real history attached to it, not a sponsored display or a branded restaurant sourcing local produce generically, but an actual farm that visitors could see and understand as the genuine article. She called two chefs she had come to know through Sybil's network who had supplied similar corporate hospitality campuses in other regions. She asked them what the volume requirements looked like, what the supply chain expectations were, what kind of premium the campuses paid for provenance documentation. She took notes. She built a pricing model from those conversations and from 4 years of her own production records and her own yield projections. She drafted a minimum order structure with seasonal schedules. She prepared her full documentation file, the lab reports, the hydrological assessment, the university study now underway, the water rights registration, the magazine article. And from the locked drawer, the geological assessment report from Hargrove's own pre-construction due diligence, the document that described the mineral clay seep on the eastern land 3 years before construction, began with the relevant section highlighted in yellow. She and Patricia drafted the conditions. 3 conditions, not punitive, not designed to wound, designed to protect what she had spent 5 years building. The first condition was a permanent agricultural easement on the eastern fence line of the Aldrich farm and on the western field containing the seep, protecting both from any land use activity that might affect the subsurface hydrology or the surface water emergence. The easement to be recorded in the county land records and to run with both properties in perpetuity, binding on all future owners. The second condition was a formal contractual commitment by Hargrove to stormwater management practices on all adjacent parcels that would protect the quality of the farm's creek and the mineral integrity of the subsurface flow, with annual independent monitoring and a remediation mechanism if the monitoring showed degradation. The third condition was a 5-year supply agreement at fair market pricing for specialty agricultural products with annual escalation provisions tied to documented production costs and specialty market indices renewable by mutual consent at the end of the term. She and Patricia went through the conditions 3 times. Patricia suggested additions and modifications in 2 places. Nora accepted one of them and declined the other, explaining her reasoning in both cases. Patricia said she was well prepared. Nora said she had had time. Leonard Colgate arrived at the farm on a Thursday morning in early June. He was the same compact man she remembered from 5 years ago. The hard hat was gone, and in its place he carried a leather portfolio, the kind that closes with a magnetic clasp and suggests that the documents inside have been reviewed by people other than the person carrying it. He was professionally pleasant in the way she remembered the practiced warmth that was genuine without being personal, the handshake that communicated both confidence and respect. She served coffee on the porch in the morning light, the hawthorn and elderberry dense and green along the eastern fence, the birds moving through the hedgerow, the seep visible from the porch in the low field to the west, a glint of moving water in the morning sun. She was entirely comfortable. She had been preparing for this conversation for 6 weeks and in a less explicit way for 5 years. He began with pleasantries. He mentioned the magazine article. He said what Hargrove was building was something the region had not seen before, a destination that honored the authentic character of the land it occupied. He believed the Aldrich farm could be central to that story. He opened the portfolio. He placed a term sheet on the table. She looked at it. She read the main points. Then she opened the folder she had brought to the porch and placed on the table in sequence the lab reports, the hydrological assessment, the university study, the water rights registration, the pricing model with its supporting production data, and last, the geological assessment report. The one Hargrove had filed as a courtroom exhibit 3 years ago, face up with the section describing the mineral clay seep in the northeast quadrant of the eastern parcel highlighted in yellow. Colgate looked at it. Something moved across his face that a less attentive person might have missed, the slight adjustment of a man who has just confirmed something he suspected was coming, a recalibration of his assessment of the conversation he was in. She said, "I believe you knew what was under the eastern land before construction began." He was quiet. She said, "That's all right. That's not what I'm here to discuss. I'm here to discuss what the land next to it can produce and what that's worth to the campus you're building and what I need to protect it." He looked at the geological report. He looked at the water rights registration. He looked at the pricing model. He was a professional, and professionals do not decide things in the first meeting, but she could see him understanding the shape of what he was looking at, the completeness of it, the fact that there was no gap in it that she had not already addressed. He said, "What are your conditions?" She told him. All three, plainly without theater. He was a good negotiator. He did not say yes in the first meeting. He said he would need to consult with his team. She said she understood. They set a date for a second meeting. She did not follow up in the interval. She waited. There were 3 sessions total. The second session covered the structure of the easement and the stormwater commitment in detail with Hargrove's own environmental legal counsel present. In the third session, they worked through the supply agreement term by term. Colgate proposed a modification to the escalation formula in the 5th year of the agreement, tying it to a different index than the one Nora had specified. She had anticipated this proposal and had prepared a counter. They reached a formulation they both accepted. She held every other condition without modification. Not because she was unwilling to negotiate, but because the easement and the stormwater commitment were not negotiating positions. They were the point. They were the thing without which none of the rest of it was sustainable. Colgate understood that. He was a smart man. In the third session, as they were working through the final pages of the supply agreement, he looked up from the document and asked in a register that had shifted from the professional to something more direct. "Ms. Aldrich, the seep on your western field. When did you know it was going to redirect?" She looked at him for a moment. She smiled. She did not answer. He held her gaze for a moment, and then she could see him understand. She had known. She had known early from the notebook, from the library research, from the geological logic of what construction does to subsurface hydrology, that the seep on the eastern land might redirect westward when the earth above it was disturbed. She had built her entire plan around that possibility. She had stayed through 2 years of financial pressure and isolation and uncertainty and personal betrayal, not despite not knowing whether it would work, but because the geological argument was sound and the documentation of Harriet's observations was real and the probability was worth the bet. She had let them come to her. She had built the position that made coming to her inevitable. She had waited for exactly this. He shook his head very slightly, and on his face she saw something she had not expected. Not grudging respect, which would have been easy and professional, but genuine respect, the kind that registers in a person's eyes when they understand they have been dealing with someone who was significantly better prepared than they were, and that the better preparation was earned rather than advantaged. They signed the agreement the following Friday afternoon at the kitchen table where Harriet had kept her notebooks and Nora had kept her ledgers, and Roy Tanner had once sat with his careful questions and his ulterior knowledge. Before she signed in, she asked Patricia to confirm that the header language they had prepared was in place. The agreement read at the top of the first page, "Aldrich and Harriet Farm, established 1974. Harriet's name on a legal document, her grandmother's name on something that would be recorded in the county land records and would run with the property in perpetuity. The way it had always should have been in the year when the farm was established, in the 30 years when Harriet had built it into what it was, in the decade when she had kept the seed library and the notebooks and the bees and the soil that was unlike any other soil in the county. The name that had never appeared on anything official because Harriet had not needed it to in order to do what she did. She signed, Colgate signed, Patricia witnessed. She walked him to his car. They shook hands. He drove down the farm road and she stood on the porch and watched the dust settle. Then she turned back to the farm, to the afternoon light on the western field and the seep running in the low ground and the elderberry dense along the eastern fence, and she stood there for a moment in the quiet. 2 weeks after the signing, the phone call came not from Roy Tanner, but from the bank's regional compliance officer, a woman named Sheila Branch, who had a direct manner and no particular warmth in either direction. Sheila Branch informed her that the agricultural loan review initiated the previous year had been formally closed with no action, all terms to remain as originally agreed, and apologized for any inconvenience the review process had caused. Nora thanked her. She set the phone down. She thought about the recording in the locked drawer, which she had never used in any formal proceeding, only in the moment in Roy Tanner's office when she had needed him to know it existed. She had learned from Harriet that documentation was what stood between memory and proof, and she had also learned through her own years of keeping it that sometimes the most powerful thing documentation does is exist. You do not always have to use it. You only have to have it. She had also learned through the county's ambient information network that Roy Tanner had quietly resigned his position at the bank some weeks after their meeting, citing personal reasons, and had taken a position in a different county. She did not spend time thinking about him. Stuart Pruitt she heard about through the same ambient channels. He had committed to a large brokering role in a development project in the adjacent county that had encountered significant permitting complications and had not gone the way he had planned. He was not active in Harlan County in the way he once had been. She had not seen him or heard from him directly since the afternoon in the feed co-op parking lot. It was in the second autumn after the signing with Hargrove that Darlene Cobb knocked on the back door. Nora saw her through the kitchen window. A woman who had aged more than 2 years of calendar time would entirely explain standing on the back step with her hands clasped in front of her at her waist, wearing the look of someone who has been rehearsing something and has lost the rehearsed version and is standing in the gap between what she planned to say and what the moment actually requires. Nora opened the door. Darlene said, "The land they bought from me is a parking lot now." Nora said, "I know." She had driven past it earlier that year, the Cobb farmstead, where Walter Cobb had planted his unfinished orchard and where Darlene had kept her kitchen garden and her chickens in a life that had fit the shape of that land for 30-odd years, and it was now a paved surface with white painted lines and low LED fixtures on poles, the kind of utilitarian landscape that does not remember what it replaced. Darlene said, "I'm sorry, I should have told you before I sold." Nora looked at her for a moment. She thought about what she might say, the available range of responses from the cold to the generous, and she thought about what Harriet would have done, and she thought about the scalloped potatoes and the cornbread, and the evening on the porch when Darlene had told her about Pruitt, when she had chosen to be decent at the moment that counted. She stepped back from the door. "Come in. I'll make coffee." She did not ask for an explanation. She did not offer absolution as if it were something she had the authority to grant. She poured 2 cups, and they sat at the kitchen table in the autumn morning quiet and found their way back to each other through the ordinary human mechanism of sitting together for long enough that the difficult thing gradually becomes the thing that happened rather than the thing that is happening. When Darlene asked if there was anything she could do around the farm, Nora said she was looking for someone to help in the seed house during the cataloging season. October through February, 3 days a week, detail work. Labeling germination testing, cross-referencing, Harriet's original notations with the current catalog inventory, making sure that the records accurately represented what was actually on the shelves. It required patience and attention. Darlene said she had both. She started the following Monday. She worked through the autumn and the winter with the methodical care of a person who is doing penance through thoroughness, her handwriting smaller and more precise than Nora's, her attention to the cross-referencing work more detailed than Nora had time to be. By February, they had fully cataloged 62 varieties that had been only partially documented in Harriet's original records, and had located 4 varieties that appeared in Harriet's catalog but had not been physically present in the collection as Nora had found it. One of those 4, the speckled purple whole dry bean that Harriet had described in her notes as drought-tolerant and unusual, proved to be a variety the seed preservation nonprofit in Vermont had been specifically searching for. They had records of its existence from a 1940s agricultural survey, but had not been able to locate a living collection. Nora packed a seed envelope with 3 dozen seeds and a copy of Harriet's cultivation notes and sent it north. And the nonprofit responded with a letter of such gratitude and precision about what the variety represented historically that she read it twice and then put it on the shelf next to Harriet's notebooks. Today, the Aldrich and Harriet farm sits between a working distribution hub to the east and a hospitality campus to the north that draws 40,000 visitors a year to the campus, and a portion of those visitors to the farm stand that Nora has built along the farm road, where she sells direct in season and where the explanatory signage tells the story of the seep in plain language. With a diagram that Warren Finch's photographer contributed, a clear geological cross-section showing the original eastern seep and the redirected western emergence, with Harriet's foraging maps reproduced alongside it. The hawthorn and elderberry buffer along the eastern fence is 12 feet tall and fully established, dense enough to reduce the truck noise from the distribution center to a low background murmur that you notice and then stop noticing. You cannot see through it. You cannot see the distribution center from anywhere on the farm now. What you can see is the hedgerow birds and the bees working the elder bloom in spring and the elderberries ripening in autumn. The western seep is designated as a protected agricultural feature in the land use agreement, surveyed and mapped and legally recognized, running year-round, in a channel that Nora has lined partially with limestone to stabilize its edges while keeping it fully natural in its function. The university researcher visits twice a year and has now published 3 papers on the seep's mineral profile and its influence on crop flavor papers that have been read widely in the specialty, food, and agricultural science communities, and have been cited in discussions about terroir and American vegetable production that are slowly changing how the specialty food world thinks about what makes exceptional produce exceptional. Nora supplies a rotating roster of restaurants across 4 states. The Cherokee purple tomatoes and the dragon tongue beans and the winter squash and the speckled purple hull she now grows in quantity in the western field, and the honey that has come back to something richer and more complex than it was even in Harriet's time, the bees now having the western seep for mineral foraging year-round, which seems to be producing exactly the effect that Harriet's notebooks predicted the eastern seep was producing for 50 years. She employs 3 part-time workers during peak season. Darlene handles the seed house in winter and the drying operation for the herbs in late summer. A young man from the county named Miles Greer handles the heavy equipment and the irrigation. A woman named Teresa, who studied food science at the State University, manages the distribution logistics and the restaurant accounts. She has received 2 purchase offers since the article ran. The first was substantial. The second was more than the first by a significant margin, a sum that would have surprised everyone who had quoted property values on those 80 acres at any point in the previous decade. She declined both. The declining was not difficult. The offers were asking her to trade what she had for money, which was straightforward enough to evaluate what she had was not something that money could rebuild, because what she had was the specific and unrepeatable product of a specific geology, in a specific history, in 50 years of a specific woman's attention, and then 5 years of her own, and none of those things could be purchased and installed somewhere else. The seed library holds 247 varieties. Each variety gets a trial bed at minimum every 3 years, and the trial results are documented in notebooks that go on the shelf next to Harriet's, in the same slanted notation style that Nora has unconsciously adopted over years of reading the originals. The shelf is full. She has been planning to build an addition to the seed house. There is a sign at the farm gate, small and handmade, painted on barn board by a neighbor who does that kind of work, the letters clean and weathered, and entirely right for what they say. It reads Aldrich and Harriet Farm, 1974. Below the names on its own line, a single phrase. The land remembers. She is 27 years old. She is not wealthy by any conventional measure, though she is solvent, which took 5 years to become, and she is independent, which she has been from the morning she decided not to call Marcus Webb back, and she is the steward of something real, a piece of ground that produces food, unlike what any neighboring acre can produce, for reasons that took a geologist and a food writer and a grandmother's handwritten notebooks and 5 years of patient and serious waiting to fully surface. She still drinks her coffee at the kitchen window every morning, the one that faces east, the same window where Harriet drank her coffee for 50 years before her. The light comes across the field in the particular slanted way of early morning in the Kentucky hills, moving from the ridge in the east across the hawthorn and elderberry, along the fence, and then across the garden beds, and then to the western low field, where the seep catches it at a certain angle. She watches the light the way Harriet taught her to watch it, not as scenery but as information. The way the dew catches in the hollow tells you about the overnight humidity. The way the birds move through the hedgerow tells you about the temperature in the low spots. The way the seep surface catches or does not catch the light tells you whether the flow is running clear or has been disturbed by the overnight rain. She checks the seep after every hard rain, crouching at the edge of it in her barn coat and her rubber boots, watching the water move. She has been checking it for 4 years. She expects to check it for another 50. And every fall, when the elderberries along the eastern fence ripen to their full purple weight, she picks them herself in the early morning while the dew is still on them, filling the wide wooden baskets Harriet used, moving slowly along the hedgerow in the quiet of a morning when the farm is entirely itself and no one else has arrived yet. She makes a preserve from them, cooked low and slow, on the same stove Harriet used, labeled by hand, in the same mason jars, the handwriting her own, but the form entirely Harriet's. She sells them at the farmer's market in the county seat every fall at a price that makes people pause before they decide and then decide. Every jar sells. There is a kind of strength that does not call press conferences or file injunctions or post statements. It does not explain itself to its neighbors or justify itself to the brokers or make its case to the development company before the company has made its move. It shows up in the early morning to check the cold frames and in the evenings at the kitchen table with a ledger and a pen. It shows up in seeds carried across 3 state lines in a wooden box, in notebooks filled with slanted handwriting over 50 years, in a young woman standing at a fence line watching 7 yellow machines arrive and choosing with the particular quietness of someone who has already decided to stay. She never fought Hargrove and Sons. She never needed to. What she needed was to understand what the land was doing, to read it the way Harriet had read it for 50 years, with patience and attention and the willingness to act on what she found rather than what she wished were true. She needed to document everything and wait for the documentation to mean something, and then to be ready when the meaning arrived. The machines that came to take everything were the very force that gave it all back. This is not a parable. It is a fact of hydrology documented in a geological assessment report filed in a county courthouse, confirmed by a university laboratory, certified in a water rights registration in the county records office, and tasted in a tomato picked warm from a vine in a low field on a morning in August. Patience does not always win, but in the rare and extraordinary cases when it wins completely, it creates something that no amount of money or machinery could have produced from the outside. The kind of place that changes the way you breathe when you walk onto it. The kind of food that makes you set down your fork and sit with what you just tasted. The kind of story that keeps being told because it points at something true about the relationship between a person and a piece of ground when both of them are paying the same quality of attention to each other over the same long stretch of time. Harriet knew it. She learned it across 50 years of living on that land, one season at a time, one notebook at a time, following her bees to the eastern field at dawn and writing down what she found. She learned it in the way of someone who does not hurry toward conclusions because she understands that some conclusions take their time. The bees knew it before Harriet did in the wordless chemical intelligence of their foraging, the 5 million-year-old knowledge of what they need and where to find it, the knowledge that does not require notebooks or theories or patience. In any form a person would recognize, only the clarity of a body that knows what is good for it. And Nora, standing in the low western field on an October morning with her coffee going cold in her hand and the seep running clear at her feet, and the light on the hills to the east where the elderberry along the fence is heavy with its ripe and waiting purple, knows it now the way it can only be known, which is by having lived through the knowing, by having stayed when everyone said to leave, by having waited. When everyone said the waiting was foolish, by having understood that the land was not being unkind when it was difficult, but was asking in the way that land asked whether she was serious. She was serious. She was Harriet's granddaughter, and she had been raised in the knowledge that the land rewards the serious and remembers the ones who stay. The land remembered. She remembered with it. They had been keeping that agreement together for a long time, the land and the woman on it, and they would keep it for a long time more. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.